The clock stopped at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1883, and Nellie Pritchard had not wound it since. It sat on the mantel of her small house at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, a carved walnut case with a cracked face, and two hands frozen in time like sentinels standing watch over the moment everything changed. Thomas Pritchard had been 34 years old when his horse threw him out on the south pasture, and the clock had stopped as if it knew, as if some invisible thread had connected the beating of her husband's heart to the turning of those brass gears. She had not planned to keep it that way. She had simply looked at it one morning after the funeral and found she could not bring herself to move those hands forward. Moving them forward felt like leaving him behind. 2 years passed in Caldwell, and the world did not stop the way that clock had. The cattle drive still thundered up the Kishom Trail. Cowboy still filled the Long Branch and the smaller saloons along the main street with noise and laughter and the occasional brawl. The railroad had already come and changed things, brought new people, new ambitions, new arguments about what Kansas ought to be. Women in dark dresses still hung laundry on wire lines and bartered eggs at the general store, and life pressed on the way it always did in a town that had seen its share of violence and quiet joy in equal measure. Nellie was 31 years old in the summer of 1885 when she finally carried the clock outside. She had not made a deliberate decision. She had simply woken one morning with the weight of the silence in the house pressing down on her like a second grief, and she had thought that maybe, if the clock ran again, it would not feel so much like forgetting Thomas as it would feel like breathing. Her neighbor, a stout woman named Hetty Vance who had survived 2 husbands and a grasshopper plague and spoke with the blunt authority of someone who had earned every opinion she held, had told her about the man who fixed clocks. "His name is Ralph Wells," Hetty said, sitting at Nellie's kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee, her broad hands wrapped around the ceramic as if it might try to escape. "He has a little place down past the grain exchange. You can tell it by the sign. He does not charge if he cannot fix it, and he does not overcharge if he can, which is more than I can say for most men in this town. Does he do anything else?" Nellie asked, because it seemed strange to her that a man in a cattle town would make his living fixing clocks. "He does whatever needs doing," Hetty said. "That is the honest answer. He came through here 2 years back, maybe 3, I cannot keep the years straight anymore. He was trailing cattle out of Texas and something happened. I do not know what exactly, and he stayed. He fixes clocks and sharpens tools and does odd repair work. He has a gift for the small mechanical things, the things that need patience and a steady hand." Nellie looked at the walnut clock on the mantel. "Can he fix one that has been stopped for 2 years? Hetty set her cup down with a quiet click. Only one way to know. The morning Nellie carried the clock to Ralph Wells was a Thursday in late July, and the heat was already pressing down on Caldwell like a hot iron on wet cloth before 8 o'clock. She wrapped the clock in a piece of muslin and carried it against her chest, walking the 3 blocks from her house past the milliner's shop and the apothecary and the new land office that smelled of fresh-cut lumber. She passed 2 cowboys sitting on a hitching rail eating cold biscuits, their hats tilted low against the early sun, and one of them touched his brim at her and she nodded back without stopping. The sign on the door read simply, "R. Wells, Repairs." The letters had been painted with care, neat and even, by someone who took such things seriously. She pushed the door open and the cool shadow of the interior hit her like stepping into a creek, a relief so immediate she almost sighed out loud. The shop was small and absolutely extraordinary in its orderliness. Every surface was clean. Tools were arranged on a long wooden bench with the precision of surgical instruments. There were clocks everywhere, a dozen or more, some hanging on the wall and some sitting on shelves, all of them ticking at different rhythms so that the room had a constant quiet conversation of sound happening within it. It was the most alive room Nellie had been in for 2 years. The man behind the workbench looked up when she came in. Ralph Wells was 36 years old, though he wore his age the way the good Kansas land wore weather, with visible character and no apology. He was lean and brown from the sun, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that were remarkable for their combination of size and delicacy. Cowboy's hands that had learned a different kind of work. He had pale gray eyes that noticed everything quietly, the way a man notices things when he has spent years reading the land and the sky for what they are about to do. He wore a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a leather apron over his trousers, and he had a small magnifying loupe pushed up on his forehead like a second set of eyes he only needed for fine work. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Nellie said. She held out the muslin-wrapped bundle. "I was told you fix clocks." "I try to," he said. He set down the small tool he had been holding and came around the end of the bench. He was taller than she had expected, with a slight forward lean when he moved, as if he were always walking into a wind. He took the bundle from her with both hands, as careful as if it were something fragile and important, which of course it was. He set it on the workbench and unwrapped it, and Nellie watched his face when he first saw the clock. He looked at it the way she imagined a doctor looks at a patient, with a calm and professional attention, not yet making judgments but taking in every detail. "It is a fine case," he said. "Walnut, yes, made locally or ordered. My husband ordered it from a catalog out of Cincinnati. We received it the first year we were married." He looked at it a moment longer, then looked up at her. "When did it stop?" The question was simple. It was the kind of question that had a simple answer, a date, a time. But Nellie found that the words sat in her chest for a second before they would come out. "May of 1883, she said. "The 14th at 2:30. Ralph Wells looked at her steadily for a moment, and she saw something pass through those pale gray eyes. Not pity exactly, something more careful and more respectful than pity. "I am sorry," he said. He said it quietly and without ceremony, the way a person says something they actually mean. "Thank you," she said. "Can you fix it?" He turned back to the clock and lifted it gently, tilting it to listen as if it might speak to him. He set it down and carefully opened the case back and peered inside for a long moment without speaking. Then he lowered the loupe over his right eye and leaned in very close. "The mainspring is not broken," he said, more to himself than to her. "The escapement looks clean. There is some dust in the gear train." He was quiet for another moment. "The balance wheel pivot is worn. That is likely what stopped it." He straightened and pushed the loop back up. "I can fix it. I will need 2 days, maybe 3. I need to make a replacement pivot, and I want to clean the whole movement properly." "What will you charge?" he considered, which she appreciated. He did not name a price immediately, and he did not name a price that was too high. 50 cents for the parts and the work," he said. "If I cannot get it running properly, you owe me nothing." It was a fair price, and they both knew it. She nodded. "I will come back in 3 days then." She turned to go and then stopped because something made her want to say it, some impulse that felt both unnecessary and unavoidable. "It stopped at the same moment he died," she said. "I do not know if that is a thing that actually happens or if I only believe it did, but that is what I have always thought." Ralph Wells looked at her from across the workbench. "I have heard of that happening before," he said. "I do not know what to make of it either, but I do not think it is foolish to believe it." She nodded once and went out into the heat. She thought about him all the way home. Not in a way that alarmed her or made her feel she was being disloyal to Thomas's memory. She thought about him the way you think about a person who has impressed you without entirely knowing why yet. There was a steadiness to him. In a town full of men who were loud or restless or performing some version of themselves for an audience, Ralph Wells had seemed entirely settled within his own skin. She wondered what had happened on that cattle drive that made him stay. 3 days later she walked back to the shop. It was a cooler morning, which was a mercy. She had worn her better dress without consciously deciding to, a dark blue calico that she had not worn since Easter Sunday at the Methodist Church on Central Avenue. She noticed she had done this only when she was 2 blocks from the shop, and she told herself it meant nothing and kept walking. Ralph was behind the bench when she came in, but he looked up immediately as if he had been expecting her at exactly this moment. The walnut clock was sitting on the bench in front of him, and even from across the room Nellie could see that it was running. She could hear it, a steady and unhurried tick that rose above the conversation of the other clocks around it with a kind of authority. "It is running," she said. She said it simply because it seemed like something she needed to say out loud. "It is running," he confirmed. He picked it up and carried it to her, and when he held it out she took it in both hands. The vibration of the movement came through the case and into her palms, gentle and constant, a pulse. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She had not anticipated this. "The pivot was the problem," Ralph said, watching her face with the same careful attention he had given the clock. "I turned a new one on the lathe. The movement itself is in very good condition. It was well made. With regular winding it should keep good time for many years." "He kept it wound every Sunday morning," Nellie said, without entirely meaning to say it. "He was very particular about it. A man who winds his clock every Sunday morning is a man who respects the passage of time," Ralph said. He said it thoughtfully, not as a platitude, and it struck Nellie as exactly the right thing to say. She set the clock down carefully on the edge of the bench and reached into her small purse. 50 cents, she said, and held out the coins. He took them. Then unexpectedly he said, "Would you like a cup of coffee? I have a pot on the stove in the back. You have come a little ways and the day is already getting warm." She should have said no. Any properly behaved widow in Caldwell, Kansas in the year 1885 would have said thank you and taken her clock and gone home. Instead she said, "That would be very kind." The back of the shop was not exactly a kitchen, but it had the elements of one. A small iron stove against the far wall, a shelf with tin cups and a coffee pot, a square table with 2 chairs that looked as if they had been found rather than purchased. A window looked out onto a scrubby patch of ground with a single cottonwood tree that was doing its best against the Kansas heat. Ralph poured 2 cups and they sat across from each other at the small table, and it was not at all awkward, which surprised Nellie. She had not sat across a table from a man not her husband in 2 years, and she had expected it to feel wrong in some way. It did not. It felt, in fact, like the most natural conversation she had had in a very long time. "Hetty Vance told me about you," Nellie said. "She said you came through on a cattle drive and stayed." "That is about right," he said. "What made you stay?" He wrapped both hands around his tin cup and the gesture made him look briefly younger. "I broke my leg," he said. "It was a stupid thing. My horse went down in a prairie dog hole about 4 miles east of town and I went with him. Horse was fine, leg was not." He paused. "A family took me in while it healed. The Alderman family, they are still here if you know them. They were very kind. By the time I could walk properly again, it was late September and the drive had gone on without me. I looked around and thought, well, this is not a bad place. And the clock worked." A small smile appeared, the first one she had seen from him. It changed his face considerably, opened it up in a way that made him look like a man who smiled more than his expression in repose would suggest. "The Aldermans had a clock that had not run in years. I took it apart to see why, and I found I could fix it. Then a neighbor heard, and then someone else. By spring I had enough repair work to keep me busy." He shrugged with one shoulder. "I had always had patience for the small things. Cattle work is patience too, but it is patience on a large scale. Clock work is patience on a very small one." "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The drives," he considered the question seriously. "I miss being out on the open land," he said. "I miss the mornings most, but I do not miss everything that came with it." He looked at her. "There is a difference between missing a thing and wanting it back." Nellie thought of the stopped clock she had carried to him and the running one sitting in his front room. "Yes," she said, "there is." They talked for another half hour, which neither of them remarked upon. He asked about her farm, and she explained that she had sold the south pasture after Thomas died and kept the house and the small kitchen garden, and that she took in mending work to supplement the income from the land rent. He listened with the quality of attention that a person notices only when they have become accustomed to being half listened to, which most widows in small western towns were. She noticed it, And it was another entry in the quiet ledger she was keeping of this man without entirely knowing she was doing so. When she stood to go, he walked her back through the shop to the door. She picked up the clock from the bench where she had left it, and she held it against her chest again, and this time she could feel it ticking against her sternum like a small, brave heart. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," she said at the door. "Ralph," he said, "please." "Thank you, Ralph," she said, and went out into the morning. She placed the clock on the mantel when she got home and stood looking at it for a long time. The hand said 9:47, which was the time he had finished his work on it. They were no longer frozen at the moment of Thomas's death. They were moving, measuring out the present, indifferent and faithful as clocks are. She cried a little, not from grief exactly, but from something that was adjacent to grief and also adjacent to relief. She had not known those two things could occupy the same moment until right then. She thought about what Ralph Wells had said. There is a difference between missing a thing and wanting it back. She thought about it all afternoon. The following week, she had a reason to go back. The reason was technical, or she told herself it was. The clock was running a little fast, she said to herself, though in truth it was not running fast enough to matter. She wound it Sunday morning as Thomas had and stood listening to it, and told herself she would walk past Ralph's shop merely to report that it was running well. She walked past his shop. She stopped. She went in. "Nellie," he said when she came through the door, and the ease with which he said her name, without the Mrs. Pritchard formality, without a question in it, only a simple recognition, did something small but significant to her interior weather. "I wanted to tell you the clock is running well," she said. "I am glad to hear it. I also wondered if it is supposed to gain a minute or two a day." She said it with conviction because she had rehearsed the question. He tilted his head. "What is your temperature like in the house? A very warm environment can affect the rate slightly." "Fairly warm," she said. "Bring it in and I will adjust the regulator. No charge. I did not want to carry it all the way down here for a minor thing." "Then it is not a minor thing to you," he said quietly, and she felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the Kansas summer. She looked away at the clocks on the wall, the dozen different faces all showing slightly different times, all ticking their individual rhythms. "How do you keep them all wound?" she asked. "I come in early," he said. "Before the town wakes up. It is a good time of day." "Do you live here, above the shop?" "Back. I have a room." He paused. "It is a modest arrangement, but I am not a man who requires much." There was a quietness to the way he said that, a quality of self-knowledge that she found she admired enormously. Thomas had been a man of ambition, always planning the next expansion of the farm, the next improvement, always looking at the horizon with intent. She had loved that about him. Ralph Wells looked inward, she thought, rather than outward, and she was finding she was drawn to that differently. She stayed another hour. They talked about the town, about the changes coming with more settlers moving in, about the battles between the cattle interests and the farmers over the land. She told him she had seen real violence in Caldwell when it was still a wild trail town 2 years before Thomas died, that she had watched a man shot on the main street and had stood in her doorway shaking afterward, and Thomas had held her for a very long time without speaking. Ralph listened to this with a gravity that honored the weight of the memory. He told her about a drive he had been on in 1879 through the Indian Territory, about crossing the Cimarron when it was running high, about losing 3 steers to quicksand on the bank, and nearly losing a man named Everett Booz who had ridden in to try to save the last animal. He said it without drama, the flat factual account of a man who had seen difficult things and had not been broken by them but carried them respectfully. When she stood to leave a second time, he said, "I will be at the church social on Saturday evening, the one on 4th Street. I go because Mrs. Alderman keeps insisting I need more human contact, which she may be right about." Nellie felt the warmth again, and this time she allowed herself to meet his eyes while she felt it. "I will likely be there as well," she said. "Good," he said simply. The Saturday social was a fixture of Caldwell summers, held behind the First Methodist Church on 4th Street, with tables of cold food and lemonade, and the Garrett brothers playing fiddle and guitar in the shade of the big elm that had survived every hard winter the town had thrown at it. People came from the farms outside town for these events, and there was always a population of cowboys from the nearby ranches who cleaned up and appeared on the margins of the event with varying degrees of social comfort. Nellie wore the blue calico again and put her hair up carefully and told herself she was doing neither of these things for any particular reason. Hetty Vance appeared at her side within 3 minutes of her arrival, as Hetty always did, with the unerring social instinct of a woman who knew everything that was happening in her community before it happened. "Ralph Wells is here," Hetty said, with elaborate casualness, pouring herself a cup of lemonade. "Is he?" Nellie said. "He is talking to James Alderman near the fence. He looks very well." Nellie did not look immediately. She served herself a plate of cold chicken and a biscuit, and spoke to 2 women from her church circle about the new teacher who had arrived to run the school in September, a young woman from Missouri who was apparently very educated and very determined, which everyone agreed was admirable and slightly alarming. She exchanged pleasantries with Henry Briggs, the land agent, and declined his 3rd attempt to ask about selling the back portion of her property, because she was not ready to do that and she would not be rushed. Then she looked up and Ralph Wells was walking toward her across the dusty ground, and he was wearing a clean white shirt and a dark vest and his hat in his hand, and the evening light was the gold-orange of a Kansas summer sunset, and Nellie Pritchard thought, with a sudden clarity that startled her, that he was a very handsome man. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, because they were in company now and formality had its place. "Mr. Wells," she said, "good evening." They walked together along the fence line, away from the main press of people, and the Garrett brothers played something slow and sweet, and the last of the sun went down behind the low western hills, and they talked about small things, the garden, the heat, a traveling preacher who had come through town the previous week and delivered a sermon so passionate that 3 women fainted, whether or not this was a sign of great faith or poor air circulation. She laughed 3 times, genuinely, a real laugh rather than the polite social laugh she had been producing for 2 years. She had not realized until she heard herself how much she had missed laughing. "You should do that more often," Ralph said, and his voice was different when he said it, lower and quieter, as if he had said something he had not entirely planned to say. "Do what?" "Laugh like that." She looked at him in the near dark. "Like what?" "Like you mean it," he said. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Around them the social continued, voices and laughter and the fiddles cry, but where they were standing it was quiet enough to hear the cottonwood leaves moving in the faint evening air. "My husband used to say I laughed like a coyote," she said. "Did that bother you?" "No," she said, smiling. "He meant it fondly. It sounds like he was a good man." "He was," she said. And then, with the honesty that only real conversation produces, "He was not a perfect man. No one is, but he was genuinely good, which is rarer." Ralph nodded as if this matched some understanding he already had. "I knew a man on the drives who was genuinely good," he said. "Joaquin Ramos. He was from South Texas, had a family in San Antonio he worked himself half to death for. He was killed in a stampede in '78. I think about him still." "What do you think about?" "I think about how someone that careful and that decent can simply be gone," he said. "And then I think about the clocks." She waited. "A clock does not know why it runs," he said. "It just does. The gear turns the gear and the hands move. There is no why to it, there is only the moving forward. I find it easier to look at it that way sometimes. Not noble, maybe, but easier." Nellie was quiet for a long moment. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years," she said. After the social, walking home in the warm dark with the sound of the fiddle growing fainter behind her, Nellie thought about what had happened to her this summer with the careful attention of a woman who had been burned once by life's indifference and was now deliberate about understanding where she was standing. She was not falling in love in the headlong way of a girl. She knew that. She was 40 years younger than this land, and she had Thomas's death in her bones. What was happening was something quieter than falling. It was more like the gradual leveling of the ground after a long upheaval, the slow return of good weather after a season that had seemed like it might never end. She did not try to stop it. Through August, she found reasons to visit the shop that were not entirely manufactured. There were 3 legitimate repairs: a kitchen scale that had lost its calibration, a music box her mother had sent from Ohio that played badly, a barometric glass that had cracked in its mounting. Ralph fixed all 3 with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. Each time she visited, they talked. Each time they talked, something more was said than either of them had planned. This was how it was between them, a steady accumulation of honesty, layer by layer, the way a good carpenter builds something that will last. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 boys, on a small farm that grew mostly corn and struggled through the dry years. His father had been a good man in the limited way of men who worked too hard and loved their families, but did not know how to speak the love. His mother had been the one with the steady hands and the patience, and he had gotten those from her. He had left Missouri at 17 to work cattle because the farm could not support 4 sons, and because he had wanted, as he put it, to see what was out past the horizon. He had seen quite a lot of it. She learned that he read, which in Caldwell in 1885 was not universal among men. He had a shelf of books in his back room, mostly novels but also a few scientific texts, and a collection of essays by Emerson that he had read so many times the spine had been repaired with black thread. She borrowed the Emerson essays and brought them back the following week with 3 pages dog-eared. "The essay on self-reliance," she said, setting the book on the bench. "He makes it sound simple." "He makes everything sound simple," Ralph said. "That is either his great gift or his great flaw, depending on the day." "Both," she said. He smiled, that same smile that opened his face like a window being raised in spring. "Both," he agreed. She noticed, in a way that was becoming difficult to ignore, that whenever she was in the shop the hour passed like 15 minutes, and whenever she was anywhere else in Caldwell the minutes passed with a labored patience that she had not noticed before this summer. In early September, Hetty Vance sat across from her at the kitchen table again with a cup of chicory coffee and said, with the surgical directness that was her primary mode of communication, "You are in love with Ralph Wells." Nellie said nothing for a moment. She turned her cup in her hands. Through the window, the morning light was doing something beautiful with the dust in the yard, making it gold. "I do not know what I am," she said finally, which was not a denial. "You do know," Hetty said. "You are choosing not to say it, which is entirely different. It has been 2 years, Hetty. Thomas has been gone 2 years. You have been alone for 2 years. Those 2 things are related, but they are not the same thing." Hetty leaned forward. "I like Thomas. He was a good man and you loved him, and his dying was a terrible thing. But Nellie, you are 31 years old and you are living in this house like you are waiting for something, and I think you know what you are waiting for." Nellie looked at the clock on the mantel. Running now, keeping perfect time, its steady voice filling the room with the evidence of time moving forward. "He has not said anything," Nellie said quietly. "He is a careful man," Hetty said. "He will not say anything until he is certain it is welcome. He is that kind of man." She sat back. "But I have eyes. I watch people. That man watches you the way the sky watches for rain." Nellie thought about that for the rest of the day. The following Saturday she walked to the shop without a repair to bring and without a pretense to offer. She walked there because Hetty was right, as Hetty was almost always inconveniently right, and because the clock on the mantel was ticking and the days were moving and she was 31 years old, and this man looked at her the way the sky watches for rain. She pushed open the door. The clock said there many things. Ralph was at the bench, working on something very small with a pair of fine-nosed pliers, and he looked up. She did not say anything about a repair. She stood in the middle of his shop and said, "I have been coming here all summer on the flimsiest of pretexts." He set the pliers down. He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said, "and you did not say anything. Neither did you." She laughed, that coyote laugh that she could not control, and the sound of it filled the shop and mixed with the ticking clocks, and Ralph Wells came around the end of the workbench and crossed the floor and stood close enough to her that she could see the silver in his dark hair and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting at the open planes and years of squinting at fine work on a bench. Both kinds of attention, the large and the small. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say something," he said. "I keep thinking I need more time." "We have very good clocks," she said. "We will not run out of time." He reached out and took her hand, both of his around her one, the way he had taken the clock from her the first morning she brought it in, with that same careful and total attention. "Nellie," he said, and there was everything in her name when he said it, the whole summer, the ticking clocks, the morning coffees, the laughter, the honesty, all of it. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything, because she knew what the question was going to be and she was not going to wait any more. He kissed her. It was not tentative. He was not a tentative man and she was not a tentative woman, and the kiss had in it the character of both of them, steady and unhurried and absolutely sincere. The clocks ticked around them. The first person Nellie told was Hetty Vance, who made a sound that was not quite gracious but was entirely satisfied, and then hugged her with the force of a woman who had carried 200 pounds on a farm for 40 years. The second person she told was the minister at First Methodist, Reverend Charles Oakes, whom she informed that she would be requiring his services for a wedding in November if he was available, and who looked so pleased that she suspected he had been watching the situation develop for some time. Caldwell was a small town and people paid attention to each other, sometimes with love and sometimes with judgment, and in this case it appeared to be love. The third person who needed to know was not a person Nellie told but a person Nellie brought Ralph to see, which was her mother-in-law, Margaret Pritchard, who lived in a small house on the west side of town, and who had been Thomas's mother, and who therefore held a complexity in this situation that Nellie took seriously. Margaret Pritchard was 62, and had the kind of face that grief carves into something angular and clear, the soft parts worn away to leave the essential structure. She had been widowed herself some years back, and she understood what Nellie was carrying, and she had been the one, early on, to insist that Nellie must eventually choose to live again. She met Ralph Wells in her parlor on a Tuesday afternoon in September, with a pot of tea on the table and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes doing the serious assessment of a woman who had every right to do serious assessing. "Thomas used to talk about a good clock repairman," she said, after a while. "He said the man who could fix anything small was more valuable than the man who could fix anything large, because small things were harder and required more trust." Ralph received this. "I would not have put it that way myself," he said, "but I think I understand what he meant." "Do you love her?" Margaret asked without preamble. Ralph looked at Nellie, who was sitting beside him, and something passed between them in that look that was private and complete. Then he looked back at Margaret. "I do," he said. "I have been working up to saying it properly for some time, but yes, I do." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas would have liked you, I think. He liked men who did not waste words." She poured the tea. The proposal, when it finally came in its formal sense, happened on an evening in late September in the back room of the shop, at the small square table under the window with the cottonwood tree. Ralph had made dinner, which turned out to be his genuine strength, a slow-cooked venison stew with biscuits, and it was a cool evening for the first time in months, the first real breath of autumn coming in through the open window. After dinner, they sat with coffee, and he reached across the table and took her hand and said, with the same directness and lack of performance that was characteristic of everything he did, "Nellie, I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you that is worth building. I cannot promise you anything except that I will be honest with you and I will be present and I will love you in whatever way is most useful to you. Will you marry me?" She had known it was coming, and still the words landed differently than she had expected. She felt them settle into her chest and take up residence there. "Yes," she said. "Ralph, yes." He put a ring on her finger, a modest gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, because he had been certain enough of her answer to order it in advance, which he admitted with a small sheepish expression that she found so endearing she laughed again and pressed her free hand to his face. They were married on a Saturday in November 1885 in the First Methodist Church on 4th Street under Reverend Oakes, who delivered a sermon about the good that came from patience and the courage required to love again, which had both Nellie and Hetty crying in their respective pews. The weather was cold but clear, a perfect Kansas winter sky, the kind of blue that looks like something painted rather than something natural. Ralph stood at the front of the church in a suit he had ordered from the tailor on 2nd Street and looked at Nellie walking up the aisle with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, an expression of absolute and unguarded happiness, nothing held back, nothing performed. She wore her best dress, which was not the blue calico but a gray silk she had ordered from Hetty's seamstress, and she carried dried wildflowers because November in Kansas did not offer fresh ones, and she walked up the aisle alone because she had chosen to. She had told Reverend Oakes that she was a woman who had run her own affairs for 2 years, and she did not need to be delivered anywhere. The vows were the traditional ones, which they had not changed, because the traditional words had survived because they were true, and Nellie had never seen the virtue in altering true things. When Ralph said, "I do," in his quiet, certain voice, the whole church seemed to hold its breath for a second and then let it go. Afterward there was a celebration in the church hall with food brought by what seemed like the entirety of the ladies' auxiliary and a considerable portion of Caldwell's population, including the aldermans and Hetty Vance, who cried some more, and then claimed she had not been crying, and several cowboys from the nearby ranches who came mostly for the food but who were well behaved about it, and danced with appropriate energy when the Garrett brothers set up in the corner. Even Margaret Pritchard danced once, with Ralph, a slow and careful waltz that made the room go quiet and warm, this old woman and this new husband of her daughter-in-law, and Nellie stood watching it with her hand over her mouth and felt the particular grace that comes from seeing difficult things resolved with dignity. They moved into Nellie's house on the edge of town, the one with the kitchen garden and the small front porch and the walnut clock on the mantel. Ralph brought his tools and his books and the small personal collection of items that constituted his life before her, which included a good compass from his trail days, a photograph of his mother taken in Missouri, and a cactus wren he had carved from a piece of pale driftwood on a long, slow evening somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. He set the shop up on a small scale in the corner of the back bedroom, which they converted into a workroom, because his rent on the shop downtown was something they agreed could be renegotiated now that he did not need to live there. He kept the shop space itself, because the work required it, but the evenings and mornings he spent at home, at the kitchen table or on the porch, and the house that had been holding its breath for 2 years exhaled fully and became what a house is supposed to be, a place where life happens. The walnut clock on the mantel kept perfect time. Nellie wound it every Sunday morning, the way Thomas had, and when Ralph noticed this the first week of their marriage he did not comment on it, which was another entry in the ledger of why she loved him. The second week he wound it with her, both their hands on the key, and she cried and he held her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was fine. That was what she had not known would be possible, that it could be fine, that she could love Ralph fully and still carry Thomas with her, and neither of those things would undermine the other. They were in different rooms, she thought, the grief and the new love. They did not need to compete. That first winter they spent in the kind of close daily intimacy that reveals more about a person than any number of polite social encounters, and what Ralph revealed over long winter evenings was consistently good. He was patient in the way she had sensed from the beginning. He was occasionally quiet for long stretches, in the way of a man who had spent years alone with his own thoughts out on the open plains, and she learned not to interpret his silence as distance, but as the simple fact of him. He was kind without making a performance of kindness. He was funny in a dry and unexpected way that made her laugh at moments she had not seen coming, which she found was the best kind of funny. He was honest with her about his moods and his worries, which she had not expected of a man of his generation and region, and she admired it enormously. He told her in December, sitting by the fire while the wind blew cold under the eaves, that he had been lonely for a long time before she walked into his shop, that he had organized the loneliness into the orderly progression of his days, the early mornings winding the clocks, the bench work, the occasional conversation with the alderman's or Hetty's husband or the cowboys who came in with watches to be repaired, and that this organization had made the loneliness manageable but not gone. "And then you came in with that clock," he said, "with your 2 hands holding it like it mattered, and those hands of yours were shaking a little. I do not know if you knew that." "Were they?" she said. She had not known. "Just a little," he said, "just enough." She reached across and took his hand, and outside the Kansas wind did what the Kansas wind did, and the fire burned steadily, and the walnut clock said its faithful thing from the mantel. By the following spring she was expecting their first child. She told him on an April morning after breakfast, quietly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, and the expression on Ralph Wells's face was something she would remember and keep the way she kept the good things now, deliberately. He sat very still for a moment, processing, and then he smiled the full smile, the one that opened up his face completely, and he stood and came around the table and put his hands on her shoulders and kissed her forehead with a tenderness so specific and so total that she pressed her forehead against his chest and held the moment tight. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. "You will tell me if you need anything. You will be the first to know," she said into his shirt. The pregnancy was straightforward, which was a mercy in a time and place where it was often not. She was healthy, and the spring and summer were good ones, with enough rain to keep the land green longer than usual, and she continued to tend the garden and do her mending work and visit Hetty and go to church, and Ralph went about his days at the shop with a new quality to him that she noticed and could not quite name until Hetty named it for her. "He looks like a man who has found his purpose," Hetty said, watching him walk down the main street ahead of them one afternoon. "Not just his work, his purpose. There is a difference." "I know," Nellie said. She did know. She felt it herself. The 2 years after Thomas had been about surviving, about carrying the weight of grief from one day to the next without being crushed by it. This was different. This was building something, a life, deliberately and together, with a man who understood the value of the small, steady things. In October of 1886, their son was born. The birth was hard, as first births often were, attended by the town's doctor, Jonas Hewitt, and by Hetty Vance, who arrived uninvited but was entirely welcome, and by a calm and practical midwife named Consuela Garza, who had delivered more than 100 children in and around Caldwell, and who was as reassuring a presence as Nellie had ever encountered. Ralph was not in the room, as was custom, but he was in the kitchen, and she could hear him moving around with the ceaseless, restless energy of a man who needs to do something with his hands when he is frightened, and she found that knowing he was there, just on the other side of the door, was more comfort than she would have predicted. The boy arrived in the early afternoon with the emphatic announcement that healthy newborns make, and when Consuela opened the door and said, "Mr. Wells, you have a son," the sound Ralph made was not quite a word and not quite a cry, and was both at once. They named him Thomas James Wells. Thomas for the man who had come before, because Nellie had wanted it and Ralph had agreed without a moment of hesitation, because he was that kind of man. James for Ralph's father, because she had suggested it and thought it was right. Young Thomas, called Tommy in his early years, was a robust and curious child who showed within his first year a stubbornness that was clearly from his mother and a quietness of concentration that was clearly from Ralph. He sat in the corner of Ralph's workroom and watched his father work with enormous serious eyes, and by the time he could walk, he was already reaching for the tools, which had to be moved to higher shelves for their protection and his. The shop on the main street continued to do well. Word of Ralph's skill had spread beyond Caldwell, and he had begun occasionally receiving packages in the mail from Wichita and even from Kansas City, clocks and watches and small mechanisms requiring the kind of patience and knowledge that was not common. He was careful about what he took on and honest about what he could not fix, and his reputation was the kind that takes years to build and lasts because it is earned rather than claimed. 2 years after Tommy, in the autumn of 1888, their daughter was born, a girl they named Clara after Ralph's mother, with Hetty's name as her middle name because Hetty had more or less earned it by this point and was honored, and could not stop talking about it for 6 weeks. Clara Wells was, from her first moments, a person of considerable personality and strong opinions, which she expressed at volume from very early on. Where Tommy was his father's son in temperament, quiet and observant, Clara was her mother's daughter, direct and laughing and willing to say what she thought without extended preamble. The house on the edge of Caldwell was a different house now from the one where Nellie had lived alone with a stopped clock. It was full of noise and movement, and the perpetual small chaos of children, and the accumulated life of two people who had built something together deliberately and well. The walnut clock on the mantel still kept its Sunday winding ritual. Nellie and Ralph stood together each week and wound it, and the children grew old enough to ask about it, and Nellie told them about Thomas Pritchard, about the good man who had owned this clock and loved this house and left too soon, and she told them without grief shutting down the story, with the clear-eyed affection of someone who had made peace. Tommy was old enough at 6 to listen to the story with great seriousness. He looked at the clock on the mantel with those quiet, watchful eyes. "He bought the clock from Cincinnati," he said, repeating back what Nellie had told him. "He did," she said, "and Papa fixed it. Papa fixed it," she said. She looked at Ralph across the room, and Ralph was looking at her with the expression she had never gotten entirely used to, the way he looked at her sometimes as if she were still, 3 years into their marriage, a continuous source of wonder. "That is a good story," Tommy said, with the satisfied finality of a 6-year-old who has processed something complex and come out the other side. "It is a very good story," Nellie agreed. Life in Caldwell changed around them in the years that followed. The cattle trade had been in decline since the early 80s, as the farmers fenced more land, and the trail drives found other routes and other endpoints. The town that had been one of the wildest cantons in Kansas was becoming something different, quieter and more settled, which was a loss of a certain kind of color, but a gain of a certain kind of peace. Nellie had seen the rough years, and she did not mourn them exclusively. She had seen men killed in the street, and she had seen women made widows by violence as well as by accident and illness, and she was not romantic about the wildness of the frontier in the way that people who had not lived it sometimes were. Ralph expanded the shop in 1889, taking the space next door when the bootmaker moved to a larger premises further down the street. He hired a young man named Peter Marsh as an apprentice, a quiet 17-year-old from one of the farming families outside town who had the necessary patience and the kind of hands that could learn fine work. Ralph taught him with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, and Peter Marsh turned out to be a genuinely gifted student, and within 2 years was doing excellent work under Ralph's supervision. The expansion meant more income, which meant the kitchen garden could be expanded, which was a thing Nellie had wanted for some time. She grew beans and squash and tomatoes, and a considerable herb garden that she used for cooking and for the simple pleasure of it, the sensory richness of thyme and rosemary in the morning light. She had always loved growing things. The children grew. Tommy was grave and interested in everything mechanical, as could only have been expected given who his father was, and by age 8 was spending his Saturdays at the shop learning from Ralph with an aptitude that Ralph found both impressive and slightly overwhelming. "He is better at the fine work than I was at twice his age," Ralph told Nellie one evening, with a quiet pride that was the best kind of pride, unperformative, simply honest. "He is your son," she said. "He is Thomas Pritchard's namesake," Ralph said. "I think about that sometimes. I think about whether that man who he never knew put something into this child through the naming of him." It was the kind of thing Ralph said sometimes, quiet and a little philosophical, and Nellie had learned to take these moments and sit in them rather than filling them with deflection. She sat in this one. "I think it is possible," she said. "I think we carry the people we are named for in ways we do not always understand." He nodded, watching the fire, and she watched his profile, this man she had come to know so deeply and so well, the lines of his face familiar as the lines of her own hands now, and she thought about how the best loves were not the ones that announced themselves with fireworks but the ones that accumulated like good soil, layer by slow layer, until something grew in it that could stand any weather. In the spring of 1890, a thing happened that brought back the old harder world briefly. A man came into the shop on a Wednesday morning, while Nellie was there helping Ralph inventory a shipment of clock parts. The man was not from Caldwell. He was maybe 40, dressed in trail-worn clothes, and he had the look of someone who had been traveling hard. He had a pocket watch in his hand, a good silver one, and he wanted it repaired. Ralph took it and agreed. The man came back that afternoon and sat in the shop for a long time watching Ralph work, which was unusual, and made Nellie, who was still at the work table with the inventory list, uncomfortable in a way she could not immediately name. The man said very little. He looked around the shop too much. He looked at the money box under the bench. When he left with his repaired watch and paid without incident, Nellie said, "Something about that man was not right." Ralph was quiet for a moment, cleaning his tools. "No," he said, "it was not." He went to speak with the town marshal, a man named Joseph Hayes who had been doing the job for 4 years and was good at it, the following morning. Hayes listened and did some looking of his own, and established within 2 days that the man was a known horse thief who had come through Wichita the month before with warrants behind him. He had moved on from Caldwell before Hayes could act, and that was the end of it. But it reminded Nellie that the world was not entirely gentle yet, that the Kansas frontier was still, in 1890, in the process of becoming something orderly, and that the violence had not gone entirely out of it, only mostly. Ralph walked her home from the shop that evening with his hand at her back, and she leaned into him for a moment as they walked, and he pulled her closer without speaking, and that was enough. Their second son was born in November of 1891. They named him James Ralph Wells, James for the grandfather who had already lent his name to young Tommy's middle name, and Ralph for the father. And James Wells, from his very first days, was a loud and joyful child with no observable patience whatsoever, who seemed to have received all the portions of exuberance that Tommy had left uncollected. Nellie was 37 when James was born, and the birth was harder than the previous ones, and the recovery took longer, and she spent more time than she liked in bed afterward with Ralph doing the cooking, with the helpful interference of Tommy and the unhelpful but enthusiastic interference of Clara and Hetty Vance appearing every single day with something edible and something to say. "You do too much," Hetty said. "I know," Nellie said. "You will slow down now." "For a while," Nellie said. "For long enough," Hetty said. She recovered fully. Of course she did. She was Nellie Wells, who had carried grief like a stone for 2 years and set it down and built something new, and she was not a woman who did not recover. By spring, she was in the garden again with James on a blanket in the shade and Tommy and Clara running wild somewhere beyond the fence, and Ralph came home from the shop at midday and stood in the yard looking at the scene with an expression she had memorized years ago and never stopped wanting to see. "You look satisfied," she said, looking up from the bean rows. "I am," he said. He sat down on the ground beside the blanket where James was making emphatic sounds at the sky, and Ralph sat with his knees up and his elbows resting on them, and looked at her across the garden. This woman who had walked into his shop with a stopped clock and walked out with his heart behind her. And she looked back at him across the bean rows with the morning sun making everything golden in that particular Kansas way. And neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. Peter Marsh, the apprentice who had become Ralph's most skilled and trusted helper, married the following summer. A young woman from Abilene named Rose who had come to Caldwell with her parents and had been attending the Methodist church and caught Peter's serious attention at a social event, which was the same social venue that had worked rather well for Ralph and Nellie and was clearly something of an institution for this purpose. They attended Peter's wedding as a family, all 5 of them now, Tommy at 9 years old solemn in his good clothes, Clara at 7 incandescent with the excitement of wearing her best dress and flowers in her hair, James at 18 months doing what 18-month-olds do at formal occasions, which was require significant management. Ralph stood up as a witness for Peter, and Nellie watched her husband at the front of the church and felt the same quiet fullness she always felt at such moments, the gratitude that was too large for any single word, and so she never tried to find one. Afterward, walking home while Ralph carried the sleeping James over his shoulder with one hand and held Tommy's hand with the other, Tommy said, out of nowhere, as children produce observations, "Papa, do you think I could have a clock of my own?" Ralph looked down at him. "What kind of clock?" "A small one," Tommy said. "Something I could learn on." Ralph was quiet for a moment. "On Saturday," he said, "we will go to the shop and I will find you one that is broken beyond its obvious use, and you may have it to work on." Tommy's face was transfigured with happiness. He walked the rest of the way home in a silence that was full rather than empty. Nellie fell in step beside Ralph and put her arm through his as they walked, and the Kansas evening was warm and still and the crickets were beginning their nightly work, and somewhere behind them the lights of Caldwell were coming on, house by house, small and steady as the ticking of a clock. "He is going to be a clock repairman," she said. "Probably," Ralph said. "Are you pleased?" He considered the question, which he always did. "More than pleased," he said. "I am grateful. It is a different thing." She pressed her arm tighter against his. "It is a different thing," she agreed. The years moved in the steady accumulation that good years do. Tommy became, as predicted, a gifted young man with his father's patience and his mother's determination, spending his afternoons and weekends at the shop, until Ralph decided when he was 13 that Tommy was good enough to be paid a small wage, which Tommy accepted with the gravity of someone who understands that something has shifted. Clara decided she wanted to be a teacher, which surprised no one who knew her. She had been teaching Tommy and James things they had not asked to learn for most of their lives, and she had the qualities for it, the sharp intelligence, the natural authority, the genuine care for people that showed underneath all the bossy energy. She announced this intention at age 11 with the confidence of a person who has already made peace with the decision, and neither Nellie nor Ralph saw any reason not to support it entirely. James remained magnificently himself through all his early years, the loudest and most joyful presence in a house that had known what quiet grief felt like, and had chosen noise and life as its permanent alternative. He had Nellie's laugh, the full uncontrolled one, and Ralph's hands, broad and capable, and his own particular combination of both their natures that was entirely his own, as children always are. In the late summer of 1893, Caldwell received a railway spur that connected it to the main lines, and the town changed again in the way that railways changed everything, bringing more settlers and more commerce and more of the ordinary noise of progress. The wild days were genuinely gone by then, the last of the big drives long finished, the land fenced and farmed and claimed and registered, the frontier closing itself in the way that frontiers do with the forward edge always somewhere farther west, while what it left behind became something different. Ralph expanded the shop a second time, and they hired a second apprentice, a young woman named Alice Burroughs whose father ran the grain exchange, and who had demonstrated an interest in mechanics that no one in her family had known what to do with, until Ralph offered her a position that she accepted with a swiftness that suggested she had been waiting for someone to ask. It was unusual for a woman to do this work, and Ralph knew that, and said so plainly when he hired her. "People will have opinions," he told Alice and her own father, who was present for the conversation. "I cannot change what people will say, but I can tell you what I see, which is that you have the right hands for this work and the right patience, and those qualities are not limited by what kind of person has them." Alice Burrows was one of the finest clock repairers Ralph ever trained, a fact he stated without qualification to anyone who brought it up. Nellie ran the house and the garden and her mending business, and was involved in the church and the newly formed women's reading circle that met on Thursday evenings to discuss novels and the state of the world, which was an activity she had come to think of as essential rather than supplemental. She was a person who needed the company of women who thought, and Caldwell had enough of them to sustain a very good circle. She also became quietly involved in supporting the local school, which had grown to 2 teachers by the mid-90s, and was attempting to serve children from several immigrant families whose parents had arrived from Sweden and Germany and Czech lands to claim the Kansas homesteads. She helped with translation through one of the church women who spoke German, and she organized reading support for children who were learning English as a second language, and this work gave her a satisfaction that she described to Ralph as useful in a particular way. He understood. He always understood. There were difficult times too, because that is the nature of life, and Nellie had never been given to pretending otherwise. The winter of 1895 was brutal even by Kansas standards, cold enough to kill livestock and freeze water in the house pipes, and they spent 3 weeks in a level of practical hardship that reminded everyone who lived through it that the frontier was never entirely tamed. Ralph worked with their neighbors to clear a widow woman's roof of dangerous snow accumulation, and helped organize food distribution when several farming families lost their winter stores. And in these moments, Nellie saw the cowboy he had been, the man who understood large-scale practical action, who read the terrain and responded. In the spring after that hard winter, Nellie planted a larger kitchen garden than she ever had before, with the energy of someone who has been reminded what it means to go without. Tommy turned 16 in 1902 and was running the shop 3 days a week, while Ralph traveled to Wichita on a business arrangement with a jewelry establishment there that sold the clocks he repaired, and some small mechanical items he had begun making himself, small music boxes and novelty timepieces that were in demand among the growing middle-class population of the larger cities. These trips were brief, never more than 4 days, but each one left Nellie with a new appreciation for the specific quality of Ralph's presence in the house, the way the rooms felt different when he was gone, not empty exactly, but slightly less organized, as if the clocks were all running a little less precisely. When he came back from each trip, he brought her something small, always something small, sometimes a book, once a very fine set of embroidery needles she had mentioned wanting, once a small pressed glass perfume bottle in a deep amber color that she put on the bedroom windowsill where the morning light came through it, and made a small amber spot of light on the wall that she never moved. In the spring of 1903, Clara received her certificate to teach from the normal school in Lawrence, Kansas, having completed her studies with distinction. She came home on the train in May with her certificate and her trunk and her particular brand of Clara energy, concentrated and polished into the specific version of herself she had been becoming for the past 3 years. And the celebration Nellie organized for her return was the warmest and most complete the family had had, all 5 of them at the table with Hetty Vance and the Aldermans and Margaret Pritchard, who was now in her 80s and had outlasted everything by the force of her absolute refusal to consider alternative arrangements. Clara was assigned to teach at the school she herself had attended, which had recently added a third room and a third teacher to accommodate the growing population of children in and around Caldwell. She was 21 years old and stood in front of her first class with the authority of someone who had been waiting for this moment since childhood. Nellie went to watch on the first day, standing at the back of the room for a few minutes before Clara sent her away with a pointed and entirely loving look. Tommy took over the main operation of the shop in the summer of 1904, with Ralph stepping back to the fine work and the specialty pieces and the Wichita arrangement. It was a natural transition, the kind that happens when things have been prepared for it properly, and Ralph made it without either ceremony or regret. He had turned 55 that year, older than most cowboys who had ridden the drives ever lived to be, and he was aware of this with the quiet gratitude of a man who had taken stock of his luck and found it good. He told Nellie this one evening on the front porch in the summer dark, and she sat beside him in the old rocker they had had for years and took his hand. "You are the least dramatic man I have ever known," she said. "Is that a criticism?" "It is not," she said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." He squeezed her hand. The evening was warm and the crickets were going, and somewhere down the street a door opened and closed, and the sound of voices carried faintly in the quiet air. "I have been very lucky," he said. "We have been very lucky," she said. He looked at her in the low light, in the way he still sometimes looked at her after all these years, as if she was a continuous and renewable source of wonder. She felt it, and it still meant what it had always meant. "You came into my shop with a clock that had stopped the day your husband died," he said. "I have thought about that a great many times. What a thing it was that you brought it in. What a thing it was that you could have kept walking." "I almost did not go in," she said. "I almost turned around at the door." "I know," he said. He had known for years, she had told him once. "I am glad you did not." "I am glad I did not," she said. The clock on the mantel was still keeping excellent time. 20 years it had been running again since Ralph had repaired that worn pivot, 20 years of Sunday mornings with the key, and it had never stopped again. The walnut case had darkened with age to something almost black and very beautiful, and the hands moved with the same unhurried certainty they always had, telling the time, marking the movement of the days, doing what clocks do. James married at 23, a young woman named Florence Haley, whose family farmed north of town, and they moved into a house on the east side of Caldwell, and were immediately and enthusiastically working on the next generation of Wells children, who arrived in 1908 in the form of a boy they named Ralph after his grandfather, which caused the elder Ralph to go quietly into the workroom for 20 minutes before he appeared again with red eyes and an entirely unconvincing explanation about dust in the eye. Tommy remained at the shop and remained unmarried into his 20s, with the focused singularity of someone who is in love with their work in a way that takes up most of the available space. And no one pushed him on the matter, because the Wells family had learned from its own history that love found people on its own schedule. The spring of 1909 arrived with everything Kansas springs bring, the violent beauty of the storms and the extravagant tenderness of what comes between them, the grass going green again, and the sky doing the impossible blue. And Nellie was 55 years old and had been in this house with this man and these children for 24 years. And she stood at the kitchen window one morning watching the garden coming back from winter, and felt the accumulation of all of it in her chest like the steady weight of something built to last. Ralph came up behind her, unhurried as always, and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window with her at the garden and the morning light. "The beans need turning in," he said. "I was going to do it today," she said. "I will help," he said. They stood at the window for a moment longer. The clock on the mantel ticked its steady testimony from the other room. Outside, somewhere in the cottonwood tree at the back of the yard, a bird was going through its morning repertoire with tremendous ambition. "Ralph," she said, "I want you to know that I am very happy." He did not respond immediately, which was his way with the important things. He stood with his hands on her shoulders looking out at the garden, and she could feel the quality of his attention gathering the way she had learned to recognize when he was about to say something he meant completely. "I know," he said at last. "I'm very happy too." He paused. "I did not think I would be, not like this, not this kind." "What kind did you think it would be?" "I thought happiness was something you got in moments," he said. "Out on the trail there were moments. Sunrises and the sound of moving water and getting to the end of a drive and counting the losses and finding they were less than they might have been. Moments." He was quiet for a beat. "I did not know it could be this. Something you live in. Something the house is made of." Nellie turned from the window and looked at him, this man at 57 with his silver hair and his careful gray eyes and his beautiful clockmaker's hands, who had fixed a stopped clock and started a whole life. "The house is made of it," she said. He kissed her. After 24 years, he kissed her with the same total attention he brought to everything, the same unhurried and absolute care, and she kissed him back in kind. In the workroom, the spare clock Ralph used as a timing reference while he worked ticked quietly along. In the front room, the walnut clock from Cincinnati kept its Sunday appointment and its decades of faithful time. On the kitchen shelf, the small carved cactus wren he had made in the Texas Panhandle on a long-ago trail drive evening sat in its place beside the amber glass bottle. The garden waited with patient seasonal knowledge. The cottonwood bird made its case for joy. The morning light came in through the east window and lay across the kitchen floor in its ancient and reliable way, and the house held all of it, the grief that had been survived, and the love that had been built from the surviving, the children who carried both their natures forward, the clocks that marked the passage without judgment, the whole long good accumulation of a life that two people had chosen to share with their eyes open and their hands steady. Nellie Pritchard had walked into a clock shop in Caldwell, Kansas in the summer of 1885 with a stopped clock and a quiet hope she had not yet named. And Ralph Wells had fixed the clock and looked at her with gray eyes that noticed everything. And the rest was what the rest had been, ordinary and extraordinary in the way that real love always is. The daily work and the daily grace of it, the argument and the reconciliation, the births and the losses and the laughter that sounded like a coyote. The early mornings and the long evenings and the 24 years of Sunday mornings with a clock key. She put on her garden gloves and went out the back door into the spring morning. He followed her, as he always did, and they worked the bean rows together, turning the dark earth in the sunlight, not talking much because they did not need to. Two people who had learned each other all the way down to the quiet parts. Two people who knew the difference between missing a thing and wanting it back. Who had chosen the present with all its plainness and all its extraordinary beauty. Who had wound the clock every week and listened to it keeping time and let that be enough. Because it was. Because it always had been. The clock on the mantel ticked. The garden grew. The birds carried on with their work in the cottonwood. And Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1909, received the morning the way it received every morning, with the wide and steady Kansas sky and the persistent hopefulness of the land, and the small lit windows of the houses where the people inside were doing what people do, going on, going forward, tending what they loved.